storytelling. As you can see, we actually switched up the area. But today we are going to be reading the Bible with my daddy. Then we are going to be doing the synopsis with Kimberly. Then we are going to be doing Dragon Drums with my mommy. And we only have 4 more chapters to go. I'm thinking, and they're not long chapters. I'm thinking we could do 2 tonight and 2 tomorrow.
Well, we'll see.
So we finished. So I hope you guys enjoy the video. Hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell to never miss another video.
Hi. So no guarantees on how far we get today and tomorrow. There's no guarantees until we actually get there. Yes, we revamped a corner in our living room so that we can do this here. It's better than the little cubby that we had in the hallway. I hope that you like our new little set. We can have a little tour later if you like. At this time, I'm going to continue with Psalms. I see that we have one person. Is that you? That's you. So we don't actually have our normal followers. I know we don't always post on Wednesday, so maybe they're not expecting us. But I'll just wait for just a couple of minutes. There's not a whole lot to see. We've got, this was a screen that we had from our old house. And then we've got 2 pictures. This was a picture that Rebecca made a long time ago. Do you know when it was?
Before 2017.
It was before 2017 because that's when Breath of the Wild came out. And apparently,
Actually, before Breath of the Wild came out.
And apparently this was a pre-Breath of the Wild picture that Rebecca painted. And this is a picture that Kimberly painted.
In 6th grade.
In 6th grade. I thought you said 5th grade.
Yeah, it said 5th grade, but it was at the beginning of 5th grade.
Oh, we have 2 people now. And then I put the Neverending Story. I haven't hung this yet because it takes 2 nails and I have to balance it and it's kind of awkward. So,
Becca.
Is that Becca? I can't tell.
Becca, say something.
Normally it has your little icon there. I see some thumbs up from Mom.
Mom.
Waiting for our followers. Alright. Don't want to wait too long. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. This is, there is Rebecca. It's Rebecca. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Becca.
Hey, we like your painting.
She hates that painting.
I don't care. I like it.
I love it.
Okay, so we had the little tour already, so watch the beginning of the video, but we might have another one later. So, all right. There's a like, 2 thumbs up, more thumbs up. All right. Okay, so we've got a plethora of thumbs up. Hi, Rebecca. We've got 2 highs from Rebecca. And I don't know if Granny Bear is joining us tonight. All right, so let us continue. We're on Psalm chapter 15. Are we having trouble sitting down?
Go plant your butt and find a coloring book.
All right, this is Psalm chapter 15. A psalm of David. O Lord, who shall sojourn in your tent? Who shall dwell on your holy hill? Of course, the tent is talking about the tabernacle. I'm going to start it over because I interrupted myself. I'm sorry. Chapter 15, a psalm of David. O Lord, who shall sojourn in your tent? Who shall dwell on your holy hill? He who walks blamelessly and does what is right and speaks truth in his heart, and who does not slander with his tongue, and does no evil to his neighbor, nor takes up a reproach against his friend, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but who honors those who fear the Lord, who swears to his own hurt and does not change, who does not put out his money at interest, and does not take a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things shall never be moved. Psalm 16. 16. Hey, dogs. If y'all are going to be in here, you need to stop wrestling on the floor, all right? All right. Psalm 16. Why can I not say the word 16? Psalm 16. A miktam of David. Preserve me, O God, for in you I take refuge. I say to the Lord, you are my Lord. I have no good apart from you. As for the saints in the land, they are the excellent ones, in whom is all my delight. The sorrows of those who run after another god shall multiply. Their drink offerings of blood I will not pour out, or take their names on my lips. The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. In the night also my heart instructs me. I have set the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I shall not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad, and my whole being rejoices. My flesh also dwells secure, for you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. Psalm 17. A prayer of David. Hear a just cause, O Lord. Attend to my cry. Give ear to my prayer from lips free of deceit. From your presence let my vindication come. Let your eyes behold the right. You have tried my heart. You have visited me by night. You have tested me, and you will find nothing. I have purposed that my mouth will not transgress. With regard to the works of man, by the words of your lips, I have avoided the ways of the violent. My steps have held fast to your paths. My feet have not slipped. I call upon you, for you will answer me, O God. Incline your ear to me. Hear my words. Wondrously show your steadfast love, O Savior of those who seek refuge from their adversaries at your right hand. Keep me as the apple of your eye. Hide me in the shadow of your wings. From the wicked who do me violence, my deadly enemies who surround me. They close their hearts to pity. With their mouths they speak arrogantly. They have now surrounded our steps. They set their eyes to cast us to the ground. He is like a lion eager to tear, as a young lion lurking in ambush. Arise, O Lord, confront him, subdue him. Deliver my soul from the wicked by your sword, from men by your hand, O Lord, from men of the world whose portion is in this life. You fill their womb with treasure. They are satisfied with children, and they leave their abundance to their infants. As for me, I shall behold your face in righteousness. When I awake, I shall be satisfied with your likeness. That is the end of Psalm 17. That is where we will end for today. And I'm still not finding Granny Bear. Maybe she's not able to make it tonight.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, so,
She'll catch up.
what?
She will catch up.
So here is Kimberly to deliver the synopsis from yesterday. All right.
So, yesterday we found out that Primer, you see the bag that he got himself into, it was taken over because it was like some supplies they were trading for fire lizard eggs. And that's probably what they were doing with all the stuff that they have. They're trading it for eggs. So, then what happened was he managed to get himself out of the big pile of stuff without injuring the egg. And then some people were coming over, so he started running into a nearby forest. And he was like, I forget what it was called, like the Southern Continent? Yeah, it's where the old timers live. And, like, for some reason, when I hear the old timer, I feel like a really old guy who's like got a cane and everything, and
No, they're just from a different time period. They've time traveled.
I know, but I still feel like they should be like that. I know, it's very silly, but then what happened was after he went through the forest for a bit, it cuts to Menly and the other guy, Siebel. And Siebel, he wasn't worried at first. Then after a long time, he's like, I wonder where Primer is. And then he hears about the egg being stolen. So he's like, I'd bet $1,000 that, he didn't say that, but he probably would have he would have bet a bunch of money on that being Primer who stole the egg. And then he waited to see if he would manage to sneak out, and when he didn't, he saw this big dragon carrying off supplies that they were trading for something. And then after that, they heard that the guy who was in charge of the hold, he's like about to die because he was already sick, and then coupled with the egg being stolen and him barely being able to walk earlier in the day, he had to be held up by 2 people. He was like about to die, and so Menly had come at that point, and she was over there, and the guy, he was refusing to pick a successor, so they basically threatened to not give him any medicine to dull the pain, or unless he chose a successor, and he chose like his great grandnephew or something like that. And
The power of persuasion.
Yeah.
Suggestive. Yeah.
And that's about all that happened, right?
That's about it.
So a pretty good few chapters, chapter and a half.
Kim, can you bring my water bottle, please? It's right there.
Wait.
What?
Thanks.
What?
Now we are going to be doing dragon drums with my mommy.
Okay. Go settle down. Okay. Okay.
Hit the like button.
All right.
Easton.
Totally more comfortable chair. I really appreciate it very much. Chapter 8. The change in temperature roused Pimer, his mouth dry and sour, his body stiff. He couldn't think for a moment where he was or why he ached, and his guts rumbled. He sat bolt upright as he remembered and felt inside his tunic for the beragged egg. He tore the covering in his frenzy to check the precious shell, and was trembling with relief when he touched its warm shape. The quick tropical dusk was nearly on him, the vivid glimmer of the sun coating the foliage about him with gold. He heard the lap of water, and peering towards the sound, realized that he was close to a beach. The call of a nest homie weary startled him as he crept stiffly from under his bush. He knew he'd have little time and light to settle the egg in warm sand for the night. He staggered to the beach, praying it would be a sandy one, crying out in relief when he saw that it was, dropping to his knees to burrow into the warm sand and bury the egg safely. Wearily, he built a pile of rocks to mark the spot, and then pulled himself back to the jungle, using the last light to locate a tree with orange fruit. The first few he batted down from the branches with a long stick were too hard to be edible. Another fell with a liquid splot. He scooped up the overripe fruit and swallowed it down, grimacing at the slightly rancid taste. Then he managed, after several more attempts, to get 2 edible fruits. Barely satisfied, he propped himself against the tree's trunk and slept fitfully through the night. Pimer stayed in that area all the next day, resting, washing his scratched and bruised self in the warm seawater, rinsing out his stained and torn clothes. He had to seek the concealing shelter of the forest several times, as first fire lizards and then dragons flew overhead. He was too close to the weir, he realized, and he would have to move on. But first, something to eat, more orange fruit and red fruit, which seemed to grow in profusion. He also picked up several dried hulls, one for carrying water and another for carrying his fire lizard egg, buried in warm beach sand. When he saw fire lizards and dragons returning to the weir, he waited for a spell before he retrieved his egg, packed it well in the hot sands, and headed westward, away from the weir. Afterwards, he never could figure out why he felt the weir and the southern hold were dangerous to him. He just felt that he ought to avoid any contact with them, certainly until his egg had hatched and he had impressed his own fire lizard. It wasn't logical, really, but he'd endured a harrowing experience and already been in the role of a hunted, and so he continued to run. The first moon rose early and full, lighting his way along the shore, up the rocky banks and steep sand dunes. He traveled on, occasionally eating fruit as he plodded, and paused 3 times for a small nap. But each time anxiety snapped him wakeful and set him on his way again. The second moon rose, doubling the quantity of light, but striking curious shadows against its companions that often made Pimer detour around rocks made gigantic by the mismatched illumination. He knew that strange things could happen to travelers under the double moons, but he persevered until both moons had set, and the darkness forced him to seek refuge under the trees, where he'd be safely hidden if he slept and dawn came before he knew. He woke when a snake crawled over his leg, scraping against his bare skin where the trousers had been torn. He clutched feverishly for the egg, for snakes liked fire lizard eggs. The sand about his precious possession was cool, and that brought him to his feet. He emerged onto a small cove, baking in a mid-morning sun. He scooped out a hole and buried his egg, marking the spot with the upturned fruit shell ringed by beach stones. Then he returned to the jungle to seek his breakfast and water. The diet of fresh raw fruit was affecting his digestion, and he spent some uncomfortable moments before he realized he would have to have something else to eat. He remembered what Meneley had said about fishing from her cave. Oh, sorry, I saw something out of the corner of my eye that looked like a spider.
Probably because it talks
It's
about
not a spider, I know. And I killed a black widow today wearing gloves and just swatted it. Just bleh. Okay. He remembered what Meneley had said about fishing from her cave in the Dragonstones, but he hadn't so much as a line. Then he noticed the dark vines clinging to tree trunks and viewed the thorns of the orange fruit trees with new sight. Using his belt knife and a little ingenuity, he shortly had himself a respectable fishing line. He baited his hook with a sliver of orange fruit, having nothing better. The western arm of the cove had been swept into a long rocky hook, and Pimer climbed and scrambled to the furthest point. Casting his hook and line into the foaming waves that lapped the base of the rock, he sat down to wait. It was a long time before he had any luck in landing a fish, though he had pulls on several occasions that lost him his bait. When he finally hauled in a medium-sized yellowtail that had every right to be jubilant, he had every right to be jubilant and think longingly of roast fish. But as he rose from his cramped position and turned, he realized he'd been very stupid. His rock was now isolated from the cove's arm by active surf. With a shock, he realized his second mistake. He had buried the egg in sands that would shortly be under water. His yellowtail was considerably mangled by the time he had paddled, jumped, and splashed ashore. His immersion in salt water had disclosed another short-sightedness on his part. His face, particularly his nose and tips of his ears, had been badly sunburned, as well as parts of his body showing through rents in his tunic. He rescued his egg first, burying it in the shell with the hottest sands he could scoop about it. Then he hurried on to the next cove and a spot well above any obvious high tide mark. It took him time, too, to find rocks that would spark and light his fire of dried grasses and twigs. Eventually, he got enough of a blaze, and he stretched the gutted yellowtail over the fire to broil, barely able to contain his impatient hunger until the meat darkened. Never had fish tasted so sweet and delectable. He could have eaten 10 or 12 the same size and not had too much. He gazed longingly out at the sea, and to his disgust saw fish leaping out of the water as if to tantalize him. Then he remembered what Meneley had said the best times to fish were sunrise and sunset, or after a hard rain. No wonder he had so much such a weight fishing at midday. His face and hands burned now from too much sun, so he hiked deep into the woods that lined the beach looking for fresh water, for ripe fruit, and seeing in the luxurious undergrowth familiar but oddly outsized leaves of tuber plants. Experimentally, he yanked on a handful of stems, and up came a huge tuber root, which he dropped when he saw the small gray grubs that swarmed over it. But they disappeared quickly back into the rich loam, leaving clean the enormous white tuber. Suspiciously, Pimer picked it up and examined it from all sides. It looked all right, even if it was much bigger than any tuber he'd ever seen. He was certainly hungry enough to eat all of it. Taking it back to his dying fire, he fed the flame to a good height, washed the tuber in some of his precious fresh water, and sliced it thinly. He toasted the first slice on the end of his knife and broke off a tiny piece for judicious tasting. Maybe it was his hunger, but he decided he'd never tasted such a delicious tuber, crisp on the outside and just soft enough on the inside. He made quick work of cooking the remaining slices and felt immeasurably better. Retracing his steps, he found tubers in quantity, but took only what he could carry. When the tide had begun to recede from his boulder that evening, he splashed out to it again and was rewarded with several yellowtails of respectable size. He broiled 2 for his dinner, toasted another huge tuber, and then undug his egg, arranging it in its carry shell with plenty of warm sand. He walked that night again until both moons had set. When he found a place to sleep on dried tree fronds, he arranged himself so that the rising sun would shine in his face and wake him. That way, he would be up in time to catch fish. He followed this routine for 2 more days and nights, until the last night he realized that for some time he had seen no fire lizards, nor dragons, nor any other living creature, except wind-borne wild wherries soaring high above the ground. He told himself that the next day, as soon as he found fresh water and a good cove with a wide sandy beach, well above high water markings with convenient fishing points, he would settle. The egg was perceptibly hardening and surely must be close to hatching time. That evening he began to wonder why he had continued moving away from Hold and Weir. Of course, it was kind of fun discovering each new cove and the vast stretches of sandy beach and rocky strand. To be accountable to no one except himself was also a new experience. Now that he had enough to eat and some variety of food, he was enjoying his adventure very much indeed. Why, he'd wager anything that he'd set foot on places no other person had ever trod. In his exhilarating to be first at something, instead of following others and doing just what every other apprentice had done before him, turn after turn after turn. He finished in the morning, catching a packtail and being mindful of Meneley's experience with the tough, oily flesh. As he gutted it, he smeared oil on face and body to ease the rough skin the sun had burned, reasoning that if Meneley had used fish oil for her fire lizard's flaking hides, it would do well, for his. Retrieving and inspecting his precious egg, he was now certain it must be close to hatching. The shell was so rock hard. He packed it in the fruit shell with warm sand and proceeded westward, striking off through the shadier forest for a while. At mid-morning he stumbled out of the shade onto a wide expanse of gleaming white sand that forced him to squint against the glare. Shading his eyes, he saw a lagoon partially sealed off from the sea by a jagged barrier of massive rocks, which must once have been the original coastline. Carefully climbing along the rocky arm, he could see all kinds of fish and crawlers in the clear water, trapped there after the higher tides had retreated. Just what he needed, his own private fishing pond. He retraced his steps and continued along the beach. Parallel to the point where the lagoon broke into the sea, he discovered a small stream emerging from the jungle, feeding into the lagoon. He followed it far enough up its source to clean water and untainted by the sea. He was jubilant and amazed that anywhere in this world of sun, sea, and sand could exist that was exactly right to suit his requirements. And it was all his. Here he could stay until his egg hatched, and he'd better make the right preparations for that event now. It wouldn't do to miss impressing simply because he had no food for the hatchling. He had seen neither fire lizards nor dragons in the sky for the past 2 days, so afterwards he thought that might be why he had given no thought to thread. In hindsight, he realized that he had known perfectly well that thread fell on the southern half of Pern just as it did in the north. His preoccupation with the fire lizard egg and his efforts to supply himself with food had simply divorced him from the concerns and memories of life in Crafton Hall. He was fishing that dawn, lying prone on the grass pad he had made to protect his bare chest from the harsh rock surfaces, when he experienced a sudden sense of alarm so intense that he glanced over his right shoulder and saw in horror the gray rain hissing into the sea, not a dragon's length beyond. He remembered later that he had glanced for the reassuring sight of flaming dragons just before he realized that he was completely unprotected from Thread, whether dragons were in the sky or not. That same instinct sent him plunging into the lagoon. Then he was in the midst of violent activity as half the fish in the ocean seemed to crowd against him, eager to consume the thread that was diving to feed them. Pimer propelled himself up out of the water, flailing his arms to keep water about his body, in the notion that water might protect him from Thread, as he gulped air into his lungs. His shoulders were stung while he fell back under the water. He pushed himself down again, but before long he had to repeat the cycle of emerging, gulping air into his laboring lungs, then retreating to a depth that was free of viable thread. He'd done this 6 or 7 times before he realized that he couldn't sustain such activity for the length of threadfall. He was dizzy with lack of oxygen, pointedly by thread score that burned and stung in the salty water. Mentally had at least had a cave in which to shelter, and, if he could find it, if it were sufficiently above the surface of the lagoon at this time of tide, there was an overhanging rock. He desperately tried to place its location on the lagoon arm the next time he surfaced, but he could barely see with eyes red and stinging. He was never sure, in the midst of panic and anoxia, how he found that meager shelter, but he did. He scraped his cheek, right hand, and shoulder in the process, but when the redness cleared from his eyes, his nose and mouth were above water, and his head and shoulders protected by a narrow roof of rock. Literally, just beyond the tip of his nose, thread sheeted into the water. He felt fish bump and dive against him, sometimes sharply nibbling at his legs or arms until he flailed the attacking limb, and the fish darted back after their customary food. Part of his mind knew when the menace of thread had passed, but he remained where he was until the cloud of falling thread moved beyond the horizon and the sun once more shone in unoccluded splendor on a peaceful scene. The terrified core of his soul, however, was slower to acknowledge that danger was over, and he remained in the shelter of the ledge until the tide had receded, leaving him stranded like a white fish on his portion of the reef. Anxiety for his egg finally drove him from his sanctuary to check it in its beachy nest. The first scoop of sand he threw violently from him, for it contained hundreds of the gray, squirming grubs. They reminded him so forcefully of Thread that he scrubbed his hands against his sides. Could Thread have penetrated the egg? He dug frantically until he reached it. He caressed the warm shell in relief. Surely it would hatch any time now. Abruptly, he hoped it wouldn't happen just now. He had no fish handy, and with their bellies full, he doubted if he'd catch any before sundown. If then. And how would he know precisely when the egg was going to hatch? Dragons always knew when a clutch was ready and warned their riders. Mentally said her fire lizards began to hum, and their eyes whirled purple-red. He had no such forecasters to aid him. Seized by a sense of urgency, he foraged in the jungle for vines to make another line, and thorns from the fruit trees for hooks. But just to be safe, he gathered some fruit and some tough-shelled nuts. Hatchlings needed meat, he knew, but he supposed anything edible would be better than an empty hand. It was while he was fitting the thorn hook into the end of the vine that the impact of the day started to hit him. His fingers trembled so that he had to pause. Pimer he wasn't a herdsman's boy anymore. He wasn't a harper's apprentice either. Pimer of Pern, he went on more confidently, had survived threadfall holdless. He straightened his shoulders and smiled broadly as he glanced proudly across his lagoon. Pimer of Pern had survived threadfall. He had overcome considerable obstacles to secure a queen fire lizard egg. It would hatch, and he would, at long last, have a fire lizard all his own. He glanced fondly at the mound in the sand that was his little queen. Was he certain, though, that it was a queen? Doubt assailed him briefly. If it wasn't, it might be a bronze, and that was every bit as good. But it had to be a queen egg, separated as it had been from the others warming by Lord Maren's fire. Pimer chuckled at his own stupidity. He ought to have realized that Lord Maren would present the eggs as the climax to his feasting. Of course, the recipients would check out of joy, or maybe out of distrust for Lord Maren's generosity. He really ought to have gotten out of the hold before the feast had ended. How, he couldn't imagine, but he just might have done it if he'd tried. Certainly, he wouldn't now be isolated on the southern continent. He put a final twist in the vine to hold the thorn hook firmly. He gazed northward across the late hazy sea in the general direction of Fort Hold and the Harper Hall. He'd been gone 8 days now. Had they tried to find him at Nebelhold? He was a bit surprised that Sibyl hadn't sent Kimmy or Menelise Rocky to look. But then, how was anyone to know where he was, north or south? And fire lizards had to have directions just like dragons. Sibyl might not have learned that Lord Maren was dealing with the Southerners, or that there had been a collection that night. A splash in the lagoon attracted his attention. The fish were back with the tide. He rose and made his way across the exposed rocks, affectionately patting the ledge that had sheltered him. It took him longer than usual to catch a fish that evening, and he only landed a small yellowtail, too small to satisfy his hunger, much less provide for a voracious hatchling. Soon the rising tide would isolate him on this section of the lagoon. If he didn't hook shortly, he'd have to retreat to where the fishing was always poorer. Controlling his impatience as best he could, for Pimer was certain that the fish heard sound, else why were they avoiding his hook? He also held his breath, and he jerked his line in an imitation of live bait. That's when the curious noise came to his ears. He raised his head, looking about, trying to locate the source of that odd sound, so faintly heard, above the lap of wave against rock. He scanned the skies, thinking there might be wild wherries or fire lizards above him, or worse, dragon riders to whom he would be extremely visible, stretched along the reef rock. It was the movement on the beach that caught his eye, more than placing the sound there. Just then, the line in his hand jerked. In a panic of comprehension, he nearly let go, but a reflex prompted him to haul the line in rapidly, rising to his feet as he did so, his eyes on the beach. Something moved on the sand. Near his egg? A sand snake? He picked up the first yellowtail, poked a finger in the gills of the hooked one, and made for the beach. Nothing was going to... Surprise and consternation halted him for one panic-filled instant as he saw the cause of the motion, a tiny, glistening, golden creature flapping awkwardly across the sands, piteously screaming. Wild wherries materialized in the sky, drawn by some uncanny magnet to this birth moment. All you have to do is feed a hatchling, Menelie's calm advice rang in his ears as he stumbled across the sand and nearly fell on the tiny queen. He fumbled at his belt for his knife to cut up the fish. Use pieces about the size of your finger, or else the hatchling will choke. Even as he tried to cut through tough fish scale, the little fire lizard darted forward, screaming with hunger. No, no, you'll choke to death, cried Pimer, pulling the fish tail from the fire lizard's grasp and hacking chunks from the softer flesh along the spine. Shrieking with rage at being denied food, the little queen began to tear at the fish flesh. Her talons were too birth soft to perform their function, so Pimer had time to slice suitable portions for her. I'm slicing as fast as I can. A race ensued then between the hunger of the little queen and Pimer's knife. He managed to keep just a slice ahead of her voracity. When his knife opened the softer fish gut, she pounced, mumbling in her haste to consume it. Pimer wasn't certain of fish entrails, full of thread, no doubt, were a suitable diet for a newly hatched fire lizard, but it gave him time to cut more flesh. He started on the second yellowtail, gutting it first to occupy her while he hacked rapidly at the fish. He knew one was supposed to hold the fire lizard while one fed it, to form the impression, but he didn't see how he could contrive that until he had food enough to coax her into his hand. Finishing with the offal, she turned back to him, her rainbow eyes glaring at him as they whirled readily with hunger. She gave a scream, opened her still wet wings, and dove on the small mound of fish pieces. He caught her first, holding her body firmly just under the wings, and then proceeded to feed her piece by piece until she stopped struggling in his grasp. The edge of her hunger assuaged, she paused long enough to chew, and her voice took on a new, softer note. He loosened his hold and began to stroke her, marveling at the wiry strength of the slender body and the softness of her hide, at the liveliness of his very own fire lizard. A shadow crossed them, and the queen raised her head and rasped out a warning. He looked up and saw that the Wearies had boldly circled down and were just above him, talons poised to grab. He waved his knife, the blade sparkling and glinting in the sun, frightening the Wearies into wide, higher circles. Wild Wearies were dangerous, and he and the hatchling were unprotected on the open beach. He gathered her carefully into the crook of his arm, grabbed the line from which the fish head still depended, and started to run towards the jungle. She shrieked in protest as he broke into a full run just as the Weary leader made its first pass. He sliced upward with his knife, but the Weary was clever, and adding its piercing scream to the fire lizards, veered away from him. Holding the struggling queen against his chest, Pimer hunched his shoulders and concentrated on reaching the forest as fast as he could. He'd always prided himself on his speed. Right now, that ability had to save 2 lives. He saw the shadow of another Weary dive at them and swerved to the left, grinning with satisfaction at its shrill call of anger when it was balked of its prey. The queen's talons might not be dry, but they scrambled painfully against his bare chest as she struggled to grab the fish head that dangled enticingly from the line in his hand. Pimer ducked right as he avoided a third Weary's dive, and the queen missed her lunge for the first head. The fourth attack occurred so quickly that Pimer couldn't duck in time, and felt a sharp pain as the Weary's talons scraped across his shoulders. Twisting upwards, he slashed out with his knife, tripping as he did so and instinctively rolling to the right to protect his precious burden. He saw the Wearies trying to veer fast enough to come at him on the ground, shrilling out that their prey had fallen and was at their mercy. The little queen was now aware of their peril, and slipping from his grasp, jumped to his shoulder, spreading her wings and screaming defiance at the attackers. She was so valiant, the little darling, so small in comparison to the Wearies, and that her courage gave Pimer the impetus he needed. He scrambled to his feet, felt her cling to his hair, her tail tightly wound about his neck, continuing her stream of defiant cries as if by her fury she could repel their attackers. Pimer ran then, pumping his legs as fast as he could, his lungs straining for breath to sustain the speed. He ran, expecting momentarily to feel the weary talons rending his flesh. But abruptly their cries turned from triumph to fear. Pimer launched himself into the thick bushes, grabbing at his queen to keep her secure. Safe under the wide leaves and among the thick stalks, he turned to see what had frightened their pursuers. The Wearies were flying away as fast as they could flap their wings, and he had to crane his neck eastward until he saw a flight of fire lizards arrowing in pursuit of the Wearies. Just as he drew back under the concealing bush, he saw 5 dragons gliding above the sea. His queen gave another cry, softer now, in protest that the fish head still dangled beyond her reach. Afraid that somehow the dragons might hear her, he gave her the head, which she contentedly tore and consumed, while Pimer watched the dragons circling the spot where she had lain and shelled. Without waiting to see if the dragons landed, Pimer pushed his way deeper into the jungle, trying to remember if Meneley had ever said anything about fire lizards tracing newly hatched ones. But fire lizards only knew what they'd seen, and he'd been under cover by the time the winged rescuers had reached the lagoon area. The Weary's shrieks would have masked any sound she'd made, and as Pimer plunged past thorn trees and undergrowth, her cries became softer. Weariness overcame the last vestiges of her shelling hunger. Pimer was more aware of her contentedness than his rasping breath as he continued to put as much distance between him and the lagoon and possible discovery, which, while light remained to guide him in the murky jungle. In the same hour, Kimmy returned with a message from Torek, answering the Harper's query about young newcomers in the southern settlement. The drum beat the news of Lord Merrin's death. 8 days it's taken him to die, said the Harper on the end of a long sigh, when Master Aldive thought 1. Determined to disoblige us, I imagine, said Siebel, dismissing the man as he concentrated again on Torek's message. No one has applied to him for shelter. There's been no outburst from the Weir, which he's certain would have been made if a stowaway had been discovered. But that doesn't mean, said Sable hurriedly, raising his hand to forestall Meneley's protest, that Pimer didn't get there. Torek says that the weir has been barred to his holders for the last 7 days, but his fire lizards imaged a pile of strange shapes by the weir hold, so he suspects that a shipment has arrived from the north. They don't let the mere holders in the weir grounds to celebrate. So, if Pimer smuggled himself out of Nubblehold in one of the old-timers' sacks, he also got out of it and made himself scarce. Which is sensible of Pimer, said the Hyper, idly twirling his wine-glass with one hand. His face was expressionless, but his eyes moved restlessly with his thoughts. Pimer would undoubtedly deem it indiscreet not to come to the old-timer's notice. At least not until that egg of his had hatched, said Meneley. She had so hoped that Pimer would have gone to Torek. She was certain he would know that Torek was friendly with the Harpers. She turned to Siebel. Chandler will let us know the instant the other eggs from the clutch have hatched, won't he? Yes, he said he would, the journeyman replied, but then he made a face, scratching his head. But we don't know if that queen egg came from the same clutch as the others. But we do know the others weren't green eggs. They were too big, and that's the only time scale we have to work with. I'm positive that Pimer won't attempt to seek anyone out until that egg has hatched and he's impressed. I know I wouldn't if I were in Pimer's boots. Oh, and I wish I knew if he were all right. She beat her thighs with her fists at her helplessness. Meneley, said the Harper soothingly, you're not responsible for... But I feel responsible for Pimer, she said, and then shot her master an apologetic look for interrupting him so rudely. If I hadn't encouraged his interest in the fire lizards, if I hadn't filled his ears with the pleasures they bring, he might not have been tempted to steal that egg and get himself into such a predicament. She looked up because both men started to laugh, and she exclaimed with exasperation at their callousness. Meneley, Pimer has been getting in and out of trouble since long before you arrived here, said Siebel. You and your fire lizards calmed him down considerably, but I think you're right about Pimer not showing himself until impression's been made. And Torek is on the alert for him. He'll show up. Meanwhile, said the Harper, rising from his chair and reaching for his flying gear, I'd best go and assist the new Lord Dector to secure his hold. That is the end of chapter 8.
It's 9:20.
It is 9:20.
We're not in a hurry because we're not going to start the
Yeah,
next book until...
my nose is stuffy.
We're not going to start the next book until next Thursday at the least.
Yep, Dad says we're not going to start the next book until probably next Thursday at the least, at the earliest, maybe Friday, depending on how things go. So I can't tell from here if anybody's actually watching. It just says live, and I know I was at one point I was the only one on. So if you're there, we are just going to say good night tonight. And if anybody's watching right now, they can wave at us and say good night too. Oh, come here and do that. Come on, you guys. They're over on the couch waving at me like crazy heads. JJ, you're almost asleep.
Good night. Oh, I got my aligners. I got my aligners today, so I'm gonna be wearing that for 5 months, and it's instead of braces. So yay!
They're a lot more affordable than braces.
And hopefully more comfortable.
Yeah. JJ, come on. He's not moving. He's practically asleep.
Bye,
Good night, everybody.
Good night.